Now we have our main speaker of the evening, which we've all been waiting for. Please give him a very big hand, Lord Monckton.
Well, after that magnificent introduction, I just can't wait to hear what I'm going to say. My lords, that's me, ladies and gentlemen, it's a huge pleasure to be here in La La Land, as I believe it is called. And it's charming of you to have turned out in what, for me, is very large numbers, given that you were only given about 2 days' notice that I was coming. There are more than 50 people here, so give yourselves a round of applause for that. Now, I've been struggling to work out how somebody who talks about global warming without having any scientific qualifications in climatology can earn some sort of credibility. And I've looked very carefully and discovered that if you want to be listened to on matters of public policy in this country, what you need is a freshly minted Hawaiian birth certificate. And here's mine. There it is. And the great thing about this certificate, yes, it's certified by LVT O'Naka. It's absolutely perfect in every respect, and it is every bit as genuine as that of the birth certificate of President Obama. Now, quite rightly, it has been mentioned by Tom Ballantyne that what we're trying to do here is to talk about that which is true. So I'm not here to argue politically for or against President Obama or the future President Romney. Oops, I shouldn't have told you that. I'm here simply to look at various matters which I have stuck my long aristocratic nose into because they interested me. And one of these is the question whether the President of the United States is the President of the United States. And this matters not because he is on the left and I am on the centre right. It is because we have a long, close, special relationship, your country and mine, and I do not want to see America fail. And there's a real danger that unless the question of whether or not your president is your president is addressed properly by those who now have the power to address it properly, then it will come back to bite them at a time when they are not ready for it. And the world is now facing severe financial dislocation. We need sure and certain leadership at the top, particularly here in the United States, and that while this question is out there unresolved, I don't see how Mr. Obama can possibly concentrate fully on the job in hand. So that's why it matters to us in the United Kingdom that this question should be resolved. Now, supposing you wanted to see the birth certificate of the Queen of England, or the Prime Minister, or the Leader of the Opposition, would you have to go down on bended knee to Mr. O'Naka, or anyone else for that matter? No. In Britain, all certificates of birth, of marriage, and of death are matters of public record. And all you have to do is go into the Public Record Office, pay your £10 or whatever it is, and you can have the copy of the birth certificate of anybody you want, without restriction. And I must say that in the land of the free, I find it puzzling that the birth certificate of your president is a state secret. Because if I were the president, worrying about this issue, And how do I know he's worried about it? Because in 2008, he released his short form birth certificate, and in 2012, 2011 I should say, he issued his long form birth certificate, of all places, on the White House website. He is plainly worried by this issue. The Department of Health in Hawaii, which keeps the state secrets, which are the birth records of Hawaii, they are fed up with this issue because people from all over America are getting in touch and saying, we want copies of this certificate, why won't you let it be publicly available? So these two, the Department of Health and your President, have a common interest, surely, in putting this matter firmly and forever to bed. And let's pretend for a moment that the birth certificate of your President is genuine. Because it's not for me as a non-expert to tell you that it isn't. But if it is genuine, then the Department of Health in Hawaii will know that, and the President will know that, and therefore they could and should and surely would do the one thing that is entirely, totally, blindingly obvious. They would open up the original book of records to forensic inspection by experts chosen by both of your political parties. They would say, come and look. You can check whether the number of the birth certificate is in sequence. You can take a small sample from the corner of the paper to check its date. You can take a sample of the ink to check that it matches the date of the period. You can check anything you want. Come and look. But here is the deafening silence. They haven't said that. They haven't done the obvious. And the question is, why not? Is it against the law? No, it isn't. It is quite clear in the Hawaiian law that if the keeper of the records wishes to make any of the records public or put them on display or allow them to be inspected, he or she is fully entitled to do so, provided that the subject of that record consents. And clearly, if this record were genuine, or is genuine, then your President would want people to see that it was genuine, and he would be content to have this forensic examination performed, and he would therefore say to the Department in Hawaii, I have no objections, please go ahead and allow forensic experts for both parties to come in and have a really good look. That, after all, is what we can do. I can go and see the original birth record for myself or anybody else in the United Kingdom. I can go there, I can put on my white gloves, I can be monitored by somebody who makes sure I don't tear the page out or write rude notes across it, and I can examine the original document. What is the problem with that? And yet one of the things that happened in one of the cases about this is that the brother of a girl who was born the same day as President Obama and died the following day, when he asked the court in Hawaii whether he could have a copy of the long-form birth certificate for his sister, to which Hawaiian law specifically entitles him, he was told no by the court, because the Deputy Attorney General for Hawaii said, we can't have people looking at the records, that might damage them. Well, hello, surely the whole purpose of looking at records, keeping records, is so that they can be looked at. And so, to me, coming from a country where we have a tradition of freedom, and where these public records are just that, public, it is remarkably puzzling how difficult it is for you to have sight of records which, to us, would be literally an open book. So that's the first question that niggles at my mind and worries me about this issue. But there are further questions that worry me, because I didn't think much about this issue one way or the other until I saw what Sheriff Arpaio had to say. Somebody got in touch and said, you've got to watch this YouTube clip of his press conference. And I thought I was going to see some hick redneck wanting to gain some national publicity for himself by having fun at the expense of your president. So I watched, and within about 2 minutes, I could see that that was not the case. Here was a serious, thoughtful man who had been approached by 250 Tea Party members. Give yourselves a round of applause. Tea Party members. And they had said, we don't think the document on the White House website is genuine, we are unhappy about it, and we are requesting you to investigate what we fear may prove to be a very serious criminal offence. So what happened then was the sheriff tried to tell them to go away. And they said, no, we do want this investigated, and we have brought to you credible evidence there's something wrong here, and we want you to look at it in your capacity as the sheriff. That's your job, mate. They might not have used the word mate, but we would. So he then said, oh, all right. And he said to his cold case posse, he called them in, he said, look, we've got to do this, it's very boring, we all know it's genuine, but we've got to go through the motions, so will you please have a look at what they've brought to show you, and then come to me and tell me it's all okay, and I will tell them, and then we can get on with the rest of our police work. That was his approach. He did not for a moment believe that this document was bogus, because he, like me until that time, had not looked at the question. It was not of interest to him. He had his own county to look after, and he had to make sure there were plentiful supplies of pink underwear for his business. But anyway, he sent the cold case posse away to do this. He wasn't prepared to spend any of the taxpayers' money on this. And they came back to him and they said, Joe, we're very unhappy to have to tell you that we can't give this document a clean bill of health. And he said, oh, for heaven's sake, don't be so silly. And they said, look, we're going to sit you down, we're going to run you through what we've found. And he said, look, I'm sorry, I'm not accepting this. And he made them do 6 months of further digging, just to make absolutely sure. And after 6 months, he said, all right, we'll have to have a press conference, we'll have to announce that we're not happy with this, and that further investigations will now have to be carried out. And it was that press conference on March the 1st this year, which was my first introduction to this, on the face of it, very strange subject. And you may wonder why it is that that long list of news media, basically on the centre-right, that you heard from Mr. Ballot, have not shown more interest in this. And I think the answer is that those who have tended to take up this matter as though it was some kind of great crusade have rather tainted the issue by making themselves look as though they were some kind of lunatic pointy heads. And they have got confused between sticking very carefully to the facts of whether or not we have a genuine document there, and whether or not they like the president politically. And I don't think it is responsible to do that. And I've told some of them this very clearly. I said, if you want to be taken seriously on this issue, stop playing politics with it, confine yourself to the question, is this or is this not a genuine document, and go and get the very best forensic advice and legal advice that you can find. And that's what I've done. Because it's not for me to jump in as though I were some sort of American politician and start playing politics with your president, whom you elected. I don't say that you elected him, but you know what I mean. And so the first thing I did was I said, all right, I want somebody to create for me a birth certificate because I want to see how easy it is to do it. And it turns out that a Hawaiian birth certificate is easier to forge than any other state's birth certificate. It really is incredibly simple. And what you do is you first of all take the form from a real birth certificate, you get all the data blanked out, you can use Tipex if you like, take a photograph of that form, scale it until it exactly fits the carriage returns on an old manual typewriter, put it in a typewriter and type in any data that you want. It is as simple as that. They don't use proper security paper, they don't use any kind of holograph or any other way of protecting the record. It's very, very easy to fabricate. And that's the first lesson I learned by doing this. Now you can't see it here, but very faintly the word specimen is right across that birth certificate, and therefore I am not trying to pass it off as a genuine birth certificate. Nevertheless, I hope that you will all vote in my campaign for President of the United States, and the first 6 of you who raise their hands will get badges. And some over here. Here we go. One for you, ma'am, one for you, ma'am, and you, sir. There we go. Vote Monckton. Vote early, vote often. All right, so that's the first point about this, that these certificates are very easy to forge. And I then went back into the history of Hawaiian immigration. And I found a number of interesting things. One is that if you wanted to get United States citizenship for your child, even if he wasn't born into Hawaii, you took him there and you put birth announcements in the newspapers and you cobbled together a birth certificate and got it filed. It was actually quite easy to do. They didn't have any of the proper checks, particularly in the 1960s, that they should have had. So you put advertisements in the newspapers, they certainly didn't check, and you could get your birth certificate on file even if you weren't born there, because they didn't check properly either at that time. And this was a known and much used route into the United States for ambitious parents wanting to have their children getting the American citizenship that they themselves might not have had. So there is a rather unsavory history there. But then I wanted to look at whether the document on the White House website really was as bogus as the sheriff's posse said it should be. So I went to another expert and I said, I want you to create a blank form. I want you to type in the details of the president so that I can see what it would look like if it was a genuine document. And we're going to look at that now, please. Here it is. This is just the relevant portion. Of course, the official stamp of my Viscount's coronet is not on the top of it. But what you see here is what it would look like if somebody had taken a blank form and had put it in a typewriter and had begun typing all the data in from top to bottom. And once you've got it registered correctly at the top, once you've typed that whole line, you hit the carriage return lever twice. It takes the platen back to the left-hand end here, always in the same place. See how those all line up, the typed entries. And it also shifts you down exactly the right number of right space, so you're automatically in the right place for the next line. And so it's very easy and quick to type the data in. And you'll see that therefore the data appear Barack Hussein Obama. You see how it appears exactly the same height above the line, and all the data all the way through does that. Absolutely no irregularities at all the way down to the bottom of the form. It's perfectly spaced. Why? Because the form itself was designed to be spaced so it was easy for typists to enter the data quickly and accurately in the right places and tidily. And so here you see one typewriter in a single pass, line by line, entered in the data. That's how it would have been done on a genuine document. And my forensic expert has looked at several genuine documents from Hawaii, and they all have this rather obvious feature. The line spacing is even, the spacing letter by letter is even, the alignment along the left-hand side is rigorous. That's what you would expect if you were using a manual typewriter of the period. That's how it was done. Now what we're going to look at, please, is the actual birth certificate, and this time we've imposed on it a grid, 6 points by 6 points, or a 1/12 of an inch by a 1/12 of an inch. Why do I do that? Because the lines were spaced out at 6 lines to the inch, and the letters were spaced out so that there were about 7.2 letters to the inch. And this way you get a very clear indication of whether or not we're seeing the same kind of accurate lineup of the data entered into the form as you would get if this form had genuinely been filled in on a typewriter like all the other forms that my forensic expert has been able to look at. And the answer is, you can see it's actually all over the place. When if we start, for instance, over here with Obama II, it's quite hard to see in this slightly blurry thing, but these 2 letters here are noticeably bigger and extend further below the line than the word Obama does. Somebody has added that as a separate item onto the form. And then if you look, for instance, at the date here, you'll see August the 4th, and then, very unusually, the comma is completely misplaced. It should be either next to the 4, much closer to it, or a little bit further away from it if, by mistake, the typist has put in a space between the 4 and the comma. But you've only got half a space between the 4 and the comma, and a manual typewriter can't do that. So that too is an oddity. Then you come along here and you look at the line on which August the 4 lines up, and you can see at the foot of the line there, here the letters exactly touch the foot of that blue line on the grid. But look at 1961. It's completely displaced. Why? Because that 1961 was taken from another form and was dropped in. It wasn't just typed in because there's no way. But that would be all the way down here, and then all this further down still. It's all irregular. It's all over the place. You go to the left-hand side again here, and you look at the word male, and that is completely out of vertical alignment with the word Capiolani below it. Now, once again, it's not one whole character out of line, because that could happen on a manual typewriter. It's about 2 to 3 points, or around 1/3 to 1/2 of a character out of line, and that too couldn't happen on a mechanical typewriter. It just didn't. I used to use these things every day, and that is simply not possible. The other thing that's a dead giveaway, looking at this end, is that here you'll see there's a curve of the lines downwards, because what we're being told we're seeing is a photograph of an image from a book that's been opened flat onto a photocopier, and so the page curves in towards the spine. But, and you see that the left-hand foot of the word male is a bit below the right-hand foot, as you would expect, because the page is curving downwards. So that we would expect to see. The problem is, though, you take the word Capiolani, and you see the blue line there, it's completely straight. And yet, the lines curve down either side of it. And I put a red line there just to show how, in fact, at the point here, the A of Capiolani and the P should actually be higher than the rest, but they're not. They're in an absolutely straight line. And these are just some of the problems you can get by just looking at them. Look at here, between Capiolani and maternity. That doesn't line up either. It's all over the place. Now, of course, when you use the shift lever, rather, on a typewriter to get a capital letter, if you don't push it fully home, then what happens is you can get the capital letter going up a little. But there would be no way you'd get the following letter or two up a little as well, because they're lowercase. So once again, somebody has taken bits of words from other forms and pasted them in, either physically or electronically, before taking a photograph of it. And then if you come down here again, Barack, well below Hussein and Obama on this blue line here. And it's out of register both with male and with Capiolani. It's all over the place. And another even more interesting thing, if you go over to the right-hand side of the form here, then what you see is that almost all of the words that appear roughly on this right-hand are about half a character shifted rightwards compared with where they should be if a manual typewriter had put them on the grid. So these may seem like very small points, but when you put them all together, I think the one conclusion we can legitimately draw is that however this document was created, it was not created by simply taking a blank form, putting it in a manual typewriter of the day, and typing in the data line by line efficiently and quickly, as the form and the typewriter working together were both designed to do. That is simply an impossibility. So that's quite a serious red flag, and a series of lots of little red flags which I've scattered around the data here. You'll see the last two letters of Hussein here. Once again, they come a bit below the other 5 letters along there. Once again, somebody has been assembling this rather than simply typing. So let's have a look then at what's really likely to have been going on. And here we need to go from the visible errors in the document to the invisible errors in the document. Now, one thing that I asked my investigators to look at is the chain of custody of this birth certificate document. Now, on the 22nd of April 2011, Barack Obama wrote a letter to his lawyers authorizing them to go to Hawaii and get a copy of his long-form birth certificate, in fact 2 copies, so that they could have copies made and, among other things, put it up on the White House website, which is where this image is directly taken from. Now, then his lawyers wrote a letter, enclosing his letter, to Loretta Fuddy, who was the director of the Health Department's records section, saying, please will you allow this and let us have 2 copies, and I, Janice Corley, attorney to the President, will come and collect them. And there was no reply until Monday, the 25th of April, on which day, by some amazing coincidence, Ms. Corley presented herself in Hawaii and said, right, I would now like to collect these 2 copies. She hadn't had any reply telling her that she could have them. So we assume, I think we're entitled to assume, that a certain amount of telephone conversations had been going on before they wrote the letters asking for this, to make sure that the answer would be yes if they asked for it. So there they went to Hawaii. And here there is a very revealing press statement made by Governor Neil Abercrombie on Monday the 25th, saying what happened then. And in the presence of Ms. Fuddy, the director of the records, 2 copies were made from the bound volume. We are not told by what method they were made, but inferentially the use of language would suggest they were simply photocopies. They put the document onto a colour photocopier, pressed the button twice, 2 copies were spat out. They stuck the Hawaiian embossed seal on them, and they gave them in an envelope to Ms. Corley, the President's lawyer, together with a receipt for what we infer was $14, because the schedule of fees and charges is $10 for your first copy and $4 for each subsequent copy. And the President coughed up like a man, and that was paid, and he got his 2 copies of the birth certificate. So then Ms. Corley goes back to Washington and gets there in the afternoon of Tuesday the 26th. And then the next thing we have is a press conference at 8:24 a.m. in the morning on the 27th, at which it is revealed that copies of the document received from Hawaii were made by the press office and were handed out to journalists, and a bit later on an electronic version which appears to have been created in Adobe Illustrator and then converted to a picture definition file by using Macintosh Preview, to presumably to reduce the file size down from the 10 megabytes of the high definition file that they got down to 370 kilobytes. And it was a 370 kilobyte file that then appeared on the White House website. And I had to do a certain amount of trawling around to make sure that I got also a copy of the high definition file so that I could examine in more detail some of the anomalies that I've shown you here. So that's the chain of custody. Now, at no point could or should anyone have used Adobe Illustrator at all. There is even some argument as to whether you can even scan a document in using Adobe Illustrator. But that shouldn't have been necessary, because all photocopiers and scanners these days are perfectly capable, if you just put the document on the scanning plate, the glass plate, you can dial in what resolution you want, what size you want, how much enlargement you want. You can even crop it around the edges if you want, so that you don't lose the definition of the central image. And then you press a button, and that electronic image will go into any computer you connect, whether wirelessly or with a line, to the photocopier. So they didn't need, at any stage, to use either Adobe Illustrator or, for that matter, Macintosh Preview. But the really puzzling thing is that if you had used, let us say, Photoshop, or Adobe Illustrator, or Adobe Acrobat, for that matter, and you start with a flat image taken from a document that you've just been handed from Hawaii, then it would only have one layer, as it's called, of data, on which the entire image will appear. Now, puzzlingly, this image on the White House website has 9, or depending on how you count them, 10 distinct layers. And these layers are odd. Because you see, you can, by scanning an image in using Photoshop, you can sometimes get a document in which layers occur. But when they occur, they have the following characteristics. First, there is always one and only one layer which has what is called 1-bit quality. It means that each pixel is defined only by one binary digit in the metadata electronically stored on the file. And that is always a black and white plate. It's monochrome. And that is always the case. There's always one of those. And then there may be any number of 8-bit quality layers. And these layers are not so much superimposed on one another, as one might think. They're geographical areas of different parts of the form where they're separated out by the black. So that way the thing assembles the whole document and you can read it all. That's what you would expect. You'd expect one black and white 1-bit layer and a certain number, not specified, it can vary from document to document, of 8-bit color layers. That is the normal thing that happens if you use Photoshop or Adobe Illustrator. And if you're not, in fact, tampering with the document, but simply scanning it in some way, perhaps to compress the file size so you can put up a smaller file on the website, perhaps to trim off some of the security paper so that you can enlarge the image a bit to make sure you don't get a loss of it when people download it. All sorts of reasons why you might do some very elementary processing, even though they admit to not having done any. What you can't get, simply by scanning it in and not otherwise processing it, is a series of layers. In this case, 8 of these layers are of 1-bit quality, and not one of those 8 layers is black. That can only happen by deliberate, conscious, and quite time-consuming manipulation of the data. It can't happen accidentally because the computer doesn't that way. It is unknown for such a thing to occur. It can't occur. And likewise, there is only one color layer on the document, and that is the layer that represents the green basket weave so-called security paper, which you can buy at any stationery shop. That's how secure it is. And one single color layer representing the whole background image. Once again, that cannot occur unless the image has been constructed layer by layer artificially. But it gets worse, because the stamp that you saw on the earlier specimen by Onaka appears on an entirely separate layer, all on its own. No other data on that layer, just the stamp. And then the date stamp that goes alongside Onaka's registrar stamp also appears on its own unique layer, completely separate from any other data. No other data on that layer. Now, there is absolutely no method known to man by which an automatic scan of that document into a computer or into a scanning machine and then into a computer can possibly produce separate stamps on separate layers in that way from a document in which those stamps were already there. It simply can't be done. So what is the inference from what I have described to you about the electronic aspects rather than the visible aspects of this document? The answer, I put it to you, is that this document was fabricated piece by piece electronically. There really is no other conclusion that I can find that is simpler than that. Because if you had wanted simply to do what their chain of custody says they did, then you wouldn't have to go through any of these hoops. You'd simply take the image, shove it on the scanner in the White House, download the file onto a computer, scale it down maybe with Macintosh previews to get it down to 370 kilobytes, make it into a PDF, you all know how to do that, and bang it out on the web. None of this processing and messing around with layers and taking the registrar stamp. Literally, you can take that layer with the registrar stamp on it, you can move it around, you can turn it upside down, you can flip it the wrong way around if you like. There's no way that a legitimate scan could possibly have allowed that to happen. Now, there will be by this stage a rather obvious question in your mind, and that is, how could anybody be so utterly crass as to put up on the White House website a document as manifestly, obviously, in your face forged as this one? Well, welcome to Murphy's Law. And here I am going from what we know to what I am going to infer from the circumstances. And this is, therefore, speculation. That's what an inference is. I think what happened is they were panicked because an opinion poll a few days previously, 2 days previously, had shown that 62% of the American population didn't believe that President Obama was President Obama. They didn't believe he was born in Hawaii. Now, of course, in all conscience, anyone who doesn't believe that somebody complies with the constitutional requirement of being born within the territory and jurisdiction of the United States, they couldn't vote for it. So plainly, this is why it mattered to President Obama to sort this matter out. And so they rushed to sort all this out. Within days, they'd gone to Hawaii, they'd got the certificate, they'd come back with it, and then they'd obviously, of course, started with a file that they'd taken from the document, if it was a legitimate document. And then they'd play with it. Well, you wouldn't play with it. You wouldn't need to. So I think what happened was, this was in fact quite a well-prepared forgery that had taken some time to put together. I actually pretty much know who it was that did it. There is internal evidence in the document that reveals this, and I can't, for the moment, say who I think it is. But what I can say is this, that if this document is a forgery, then we cannot necessarily accuse the President of perpetrating or playing any part in that forgery. Yes, in the press conference he made a statement saying, we have put out today further information on my site of birth. But that is not to say that he knew this document to be a forgery. Because he, like me, we have this in common, you know, was born at the age of 0. And the trouble with that is you don't actually really know quite what's going on around you. And so I can't tell you that I wasn't born in Hawaii. And for the same reason, I don't think we can necessarily hold it against President Obama that a forged document has appeared on his website. He may not have known about this. There is no proof that he has done anything wrong here, and I want to make that very plain in view of some remarks that you may have heard elsewhere on this subject. I do not know, and do not think it legitimate to infer, that he has in any way done anything wrong. But there is clearly one group of people who have very definitely, other than the forger himself or herself, I will not give you any clue, who knows if this document is a forgery, that it is a forgery. And who would that be, ladies and gentlemen? The Department of Health in Hawaii. So what I'd like to do is to move on, if I may, to what is going to happen next. Now, as you know, there have been various attempts by the usual suspects, pointy heads, a lot of them, to mount challenges to putting the President's name on the ballot. Most of these challenges were depressingly ill-conceived, poorly researched. The evidential chain was not clear. They didn't put in proper affidavits. One of them even applied to the Supreme Court rather than the Court of First Instance. Mistakes all over the shop. And in just about all of those cases, if I had been the judge, I would have thrown them out, which is exactly what the judges did. What has happened as a result of this foolish behaviour by people who got overexcited and didn't get proper legal advice and do it carefully is that they have probably more or less shut down any possibility of pursuing this matter by way of the civil route, where you go and you challenge the right of the Democratic National Committee to nominate the President, or you challenge the right of the Secretary of State for your state to put him on the ballot. That route has pretty much been closed off because the judges have been so fed up with these people that they have simply refused to give them standing to be heard at all, and in making that finding, they have established a precedent. There is one exception, and that is the poor guy who made the mistake of going to the Alabama Supreme Court instead of the Alabama State District Court, where he would have been given a hearing. But what was interesting about the Alabama court, at first, they simply issued a piece of paper saying, we reject this out of hand, without saying why. But one of the judges, a wise old bird, name of Tom Parker, a very senior judge of the Supreme Court of Alabama, we're not talking about some pointy head here, it's a serious judge, he issued what is called, rather perplexingly, an unpublished opinion, because the court published it alongside the court's findings. And what this unpublished published opinion said is that very clearly there are grounds for profound concern as a result of what was put in the documents submitted by Mr. Hugh McInnish, the plaintiff in this case, to the court. He said, I'm sorry, we can't deal with it because you have to go to the lower court first. And he said you also have to have a proper affidavits and not just make wild allegations and not put your name to them. You have to do it right. And the guy essentially represented himself, which is why he got so much wrong. But the court having made that remark, obiter, which means just in passing, that there's clearly something that smells here, it is very likely that if either Mr. McInnish or any citizen of Alabama were to go to the State District Court and include among the paperwork the unpublished opinion of Judge Tom Parker, then the State District Court would feel more or less obliged to give that plaintiff standing. In other words, the right to be heard in front of the court at all. So you heard it here first. I think that one of the things that is going to happen next is that somebody in Alabama is going to wake up, come off the Kool-Aid, realise that the judge has handed them this case on a plate, and go along and file an action, whether against the Democratic National Committee or, more likely, if it's the State District Court, against the Secretary of State for Alabama, or whoever it is, I'm not sure who it is in that state, who is the electoral registration officer for the presidential election as part of a general election on the 5th of November 2012. So that's thing number one that I think is very likely to happen, regardless of what you or I or anyone do or think about this. But there's something else that's going to happen, because not only did I consult forensic experts so that I could show you what was wrong with the document on its face and what was wrong with the document electronically when you go behind what you see there, but also I consulted one of the most eminent constitutional lawyers in the country. And that lawyer spent one of the most fascinating hours, from my point of view, on the phone that I have ever had. And he said he was astonished that this matter had not yet been brought to a resolution for two reasons. One, he agreed with me that a president obviously worried by this, and the department in Hawaii, obviously fed up with all the inquiries, would have done the obvious by now and opened the books to forensic investigators for both sides in an open and perfectly natural way. But the other thing he said was that to overcome what he saw as the formidable problem of getting standing in a civil action, the one person who unquestionably always does have standing to ask just about any question, look at just about any document that might be relevant to his case, is the defendant in a criminal case, where the prosecution has alleged that he's committed a crime that was signed into law by a statute signed by President Obama himself. Any new crime created by President Obama, for instance, if you look at the National Defense Authorization Act, you find a number of crimes in there. We may not think those crimes ought to be crimes, but they're in the Act. It's passed by Congress and signed by the President. And under your Constitution, it has to be either signed by the President, or if he doesn't get round to it for 10 days, then it can become law. But he signed it, and therefore that act is only an act because he signed it. And so if a criminal defendant charged under that act, and his attorneys wake up and realise this point, which I got, not because I'm clever, because I was given it by this very eminent constitutional lawyer, then all he has to do is to say, right, I'm playing what's called a Brady card. Now, Brady and Maryland, 49 years ago, was a case which established the principle that if the defense requests from the prosecution any evidence, document, material, or other matter which is in the prosecution's possession or control, and which might be of assistance to the defense, the prosecution is obliged to hand it over without arguing and no questions asked. So it is open to the attorneys for anyone charged of a crime signed into law by President Obama to play the Brady card, as it's known, and say, I don't think that the act of Congress, which I'm being accused under, is a real act of Congress. And if it isn't, then the criminal offences that it creates don't exist. And therefore, I'm home free. Even if I did something wrong, I'm out of here. And so what is the President going to do? He signed all these things into law, and according to the constitutional lawyer, it is only a matter of time before a firm of attorneys somewhere wakes up and realises that they can say to the judge, we want forensic investigators on our behalf to go and look at the original records in Hawaii to satisfy ourselves in view of the legitimate doubt on the matter created by the fact that a seasoned law enforcement officer, after a 6-month investigation, has found legitimate doubt about whether this document is genuine. We want to check that it is genuine before we will accept that that act is validly passed or made. And the defense has the absolute right to do that. So that is going to happen at some time in the next few months. I can't say when or who, not my business to. But that it is likely to happen is something which the constitutional attorney whom I consulted thinks very highly probable. So what advice then would one give to those in the administration who are at the moment rather carefully looking the other way on this matter? It is simply this. It's far better, if you are in government, to try to keep control of those events that you can control, because otherwise events that you can't control may bring you down. And so once again, this points to the President taking the initiative before he's forced into it by either a civil case in Alabama or a criminal case anywhere. And he simply opens up that record and allows people to see it. Now, I've given you quite a lot of detail about this because I was specifically asked by the organisers that I should concentrate chiefly on this issue. And what I hope you will have gathered from what I've said is, first of all, that Britain does have a legitimate interest in seeing that the United States does not fail, particularly at this time of economic crisis. Very important that your President should be fully in command of events as far as it is possible for him to be. So I am not here to say to you, your President isn't your President, or ought not to be your President, or I don't like his politics. I'm not saying any of those things because it is not my business as a guest in your country to say them. What I am saying, in friendship across the Atlantic to your great nation, is that you really cannot simply ignore your own constitution. There's a notice here which puts it in a nutshell. Obey the Constitution. And I was talking to a very senior Republican lawyer about this to say, why are the Republicans, among most of the establishment, not touching this? He said there are various reasons. One is the pointing heads. Everybody who has stood up on this issue has made wild accusations, pushed it beyond where it would go, clearly playing politics. We don't want to get into that. The next reason, which I heard from Congressman Jim Sensenbrenner, who's an old friend of mine and probably got the best head on him of anybody in either house of Congress, he said, hey, if we knock out Obama, we'll get Joe Biden. I thought that was quite an entertaining reason, but this lawyer friend, he said the other thing is, he said, you know, it really doesn't matter. And I said to him, just a moment. And in fact, there's a fellow called Geraldo Rivera, you know, he interviewed me on this the other day. And he started off in that marvellous way he has. First of all, he said, you're on crack. Then he said, you are a racist. Then he said, you're not a real lord. Then he said, you're a birther. Then he said, you're a climate denier. I mean, 5 insults in about 30 seconds. I was rather taken aback, having been invited onto his show. But anyway, he said, of course, none of this mattered. And they had some awful Marxist from a pressure group on the other side saying, of course, that Obama was a saint and anybody who raised this question was a pointy head and ought to go and get a life and all that sort of stuff. So I simply said this. I said, look, I'll tell you why I think it matters. Because unlike us, you have a written constitution. And your constitution says it does matter. And when I said to the constitutional lawyer I consulted, does this actually really matter? Do we need to worry about any of this at all? Are we not all wasting our time? Can't we just let him be president, even if he did come from Kenya or Indonesia or Mars or somewhere? I said, can't we just let him be? And the lawyer said, so what you're saying is we should ignore our constitution. I said, well, maybe that particular provision, which had a historical reason, we heard a bit about that earlier, is now defunct. It no longer really applies. I said, you know, there is an argument for that. He said, rather sniffily, he said, well, your constitution may work like that, he said. But our constitution is very straightforward. You amend it, or you abide by it. His word, not mine. So what I hope you have gathered from my remarks on this subject today is that I am not seeking to interfere in your politics. What I say because I love America. I do not want to see your country damaged. I do not want to see it fail. I do not want to see it brought low by the international sniggering behind the hands of diplomats and leaders of other countries who are watching this situation, have realized that there is something amiss, and cannot understand why, at least at the very basic level of competence, this matter has not been definitively and swiftly addressed.